Throughout my career, I've conducted quite a few interviews for young network engineers. One of my favorite questions was something like this. Tell me, there are network devices that operate at the third layer of the OSE model. There are routers, firewalls, and NGFWs. What's the fundamental difference between them? Candidates usually responded something like this. There are routers, they're needed to forward traffic, and there are firewalls, and they're needed to protect that traffic. Well, NGFWs naturally protect traffic better than anyone else. After hearing roughly that kind of answer, I'd ask the next question. Well look, routers have access lists, don't they? With them you can set permissions for traffic. And firewalls also have access lists. Both of them do. So what's the difference then? And at this point, typical candidates would freeze up a bit. Let's figure this out. Let's start with routers and their access lists. While the syntax or general appearance of configurations for both routers and firewalls looks roughly the same when it comes to writing access rules, there's a big difference in their operating logic. On a router, we specify traffic source, traffic destination, port protocol. Everything's clear, it's the same as everywhere else. However, the router applies these settings like a template to incoming traffic, and then decides whether it can be passed or not. But what does a firewall do? Here we have a somewhat more complex mechanism. The firewall actively monitors something called a session. Essentially, who's the initiator of the request and who's the destination of the request. So if we have a rule written that allows an internal host in our network to go somewhere outside, say to the internet, and we initiate a session, then the return request will pass through that same permissive rule. And then, without getting into deep technical details, we get the following picture. To describe traffic that can pass through a router, we need to write 2 lines of access lists and bind them to external and internal interfaces, showing traffic in one direction and return traffic. Well, for example, for TCP protocol, for a firewall, we only need to write 1 line of access rules, say from our internal network to some host on the internet, and return traffic will be allowed despite there being only 1 line, because the firewall controls the session itself. The consequence of this is that network attacks, where malicious hackers send us fake responses to traffic, will easily pass through a router, but will never pass through a firewall. That's where the protection mechanism lies. This mechanism is called stateful firewall. The session tracking mechanism. It exists in both regular firewalls and NGFWs. So how does NGFW differ? As technology developed, people, including malicious hackers, suddenly realized that for any application you can use not the standard port, but an arbitrary one. For example, the SSH protocol. Everyone knows it works on port 22, and through it we mostly get terminal access to various consoles. Whether it's Linux servers, network devices, or something similar. Okay, so nothing prevents, and probably some of you have encountered this, configuring this protocol on a different port. 389, 1000, 5000, whatever port you want. And the protocol will work just as it did before. However, let's return to our examples. Firewall, NGFW. For a firewall, we'd need to describe in access rules all the ports and protocols our application works on. Port 22, some other port there, but on NGFW, there's a capability to identify application. In access rules, we can specify the SSH application, and after that our device will monitor specifically this application, regardless of which port is used. This technology, you could say, is fundamental for NGFW. Besides this, it's important to note that in today's reality, such technology alone doesn't give any manufacturer a competitive advantage. And any NGFW device has additional technological modules. They include streaming network antivirus, URL filtering, IPS IDs, and other components that help secure and control network traffic. And finally, here's a tricky question. So which of these devices is better? The answer to this would be none, because routers are primarily needed to handle huge volumes of traffic. NGFW are naturally the most advanced modern security devices, and naturally it's better to acquire them. However, the desire to acquire the most advanced models doesn't always align with the financial capabilities of the organizations you work for. And sometimes for your specific needs, a regular old firewall will do just fine. So all three types of devices can currently coexist perfectly well, be used simultaneously depending on what tasks are set before them. If you have to choose, then naturally routers are needed to handle large volumes of traffic, and in modern conditions, when possible, you should always choose NGFW. What's important to definitely note, if you just install NGFW out of the box in your network and don't pay any additional attention to them, they won't differ much from a regular firewall. Only in combination with the attention you give them and integrations with a whole range of other systems in your company will give you the opportunity to fully unlock all the advantages of this type of device and use it to its full potential. About how to pay attention and what exactly can be configured on NGFW we'll definitely talk about, but some other time.